The Fox Kids Club is brought to you by the Eclipse Studios Patreon. You can find it at www.patreon.com/Eclipse Studios Network. Your contribution will be greatly appreciated, as every dollar goes towards research, production software, stock footage, and everything needed to create the best video that I can. You can also support me by subscribing to my channel, hitting the bell icon for notifications, and spreading the word far and wide on social media. Thank you, and enjoy the show. They say history is written by the winners. I believe it. I work retail. I can speak from experience here. At least once a day, I will see somebody in the store wearing a 90s Nicktoons shirt. There's nothing wrong with 90s Nicktoons. Those cartoons are certainly great, and the rise of Nickelodeon to dominance is probably the story of the 1990s in kids' TV as a whole. But it was more of a slow climb than a sudden ascent. Nick didn't overtake the broadcast networks until relatively late in the decade. But it's not like they obliterated Saturday morning right away. Saturday morning was already being chipped away at. In the 1980s, spurred by deregulation and an explosion in local independent stations, cartoons proliferated in weekday afternoon syndication. This market, originally dominated by low-quality toy tie-ins, got a significant boost with Disney's high-quality DuckTales in 1987. At the same time, many of these stations joined a new, fledgling fourth network known as Fox. When Disney started getting cute with business terms for their shows, Fox went into business for themselves and created the Fox Kids Network. Making the fortuitous choice of tapping a veteran studio boss with big ideas as its network head, Fox Kids overtook the established Saturday morning blocks in just its third year, and that was before they even stumbled into a mega hit the very next season. It could have lasted, and it probably should have lasted, but a combination of a radically changing affiliate base, changing government regulations, a vastly changing kids' TV marketplace, and a disastrous venture into cable television all meant that, 12 years almost to the day, the Fox Kids Network signed off the air, its time slots going to 4Kids Entertainment on weekends, and on weekdays to shows like Judge Judy. Its programming library ended up in the Disney Vault 18 years before Disney snagged the rest of 20th Century Fox. The story of Fox Kids is a fascinating one, and honestly, it's one that should be told. One story at a time, one show at a time. So get ready to take one hell of a ride. You're inducted into the Fox Kids Club. To understand what Fox Kids was, we have to start with the early days of television. Before streaming services, before HD, before 500 channel cable, before even color. When TV first arrived in American homes, it was not long before shows like Howdy Doody and Captain Kangaroo were entertaining kids with their cheerful hosts and puppet antics. Cartoons also migrated to the new medium, both the great shorts of the silver screen and original creations for television, led by the Hanna-Barbera studio. While the financial realities of television necessarily meant a far less lavish product, characters like Yogi Bear, Huckleberry Hound, and Fred Flintstone made a lasting impact on the collective consciousness of a generation. By the late 1960s, all three major networks had adopted Saturday mornings as their exclusive programming destination for kids. Youngsters growing up got to experience 4 to 5 hours of nothing but cartoons and live action shows so outlandish they may as well have been cartoons. The likes of Scooby-Doo, the Hair Bear Bunch, the Super Friends, and a whole lot more dominated the airwaves during this period. While this sounds like paradise, it really was not. The quality of animation in particular was on the decline. Shows were decided upon by network executives. Scooby-Doo was a vivid example of this. CBS programming wizard Fred Silverman was just as heavily involved in the program's creation as its actual creators over at the Hanna-Barbera studio. With just 3 national networks, the medium of television animation began to stagnate. Much of Hanna-Barbera's output during the 1970s, for example, can be distilled to Scooby-Doo, but blank. Scooby-Doo, but the dog is a shark. Scooby-Doo, but the dog is a ghost. Scooby-Doo, but there are 2 dogs. By the dawn of the 1980s, the medium of children's programming was in clear recession. It got worse, but by the end of the decade, new outlets, new studios, and new emerging talent heralded the beginnings of a revival. The most pivotal new outlets were beginning to come into their own around this time: independent television stations. If you were born after 1993, you might not realize this, but many of those stations that currently air Fox or CW programming originally had no network affiliation at all, hence the term independent. These were usually UHF stations that, before the dawn of cable, didn't have as much reach as the big network affiliates. In fact, until 1964, TV sets in the United States were not required to have tuners that could receive these UHF channels. Even when sets were required to include UHF tuners, the comparatively poor reach of these stations in the days of analog television signals meant that many markets only had 1 or 2 independent stations, if they had any at all. What changed this? Well, cable. Analog reception was notoriously finicky, and if you didn't live in the right area, it was almost non-existent. And UHF stations were the hardest to receive in suboptimal conditions. Yes, cable would prove to be a major source of programming beginning in the 1980s, and the original programming on channels like Nickelodeon would eclipse that of broadcast by the end of the 1990s. But in the beginning, cable's biggest impact wasn't the original programming. It was that it simply leveled the playing field. This helped the number of independent stations explode from 100 in 1980 to about 3 times that by the middle of the decade. So, how did independent stations run? Well, most of them would engage in the art of counter-programming. In prime time, when the networks would run their top shows, your average independent would typically run a nightly movie.
If you've seen the neighborhoods disappear, you need to watch.
I said I'm going to get myself a gun.
If you've seen the violence run rampant, you need to watch.
Somebody help me!
If you've seen the children live in fear, you need to watch.
You're finished, big man.
If you care about the decay of your neighbors,
What I want to know is when are you guys going to give up some protection from those bastards?
you need to watch this powerful story of a community taking back the streets. Defiance, Monday at 8 on Philly 57.
At the dinner hour, when the network affiliates would run their local and national newscasts, the indies would program sitcom reruns like MASH or Happy Days.
Friday at 5:30. Charles.
Oh, good, Jamie. Look, we need groceries. Can you go to the market?
No.
is in charge?
No, Adam, you cannot set off fireworks in the living room.
Charles in Charge, Friday at 5:30 here on Philly 57.
And in the afternoons, where the networks ran their soap operas and talk shows, these stations proudly aired kid shows just in time for school to let out. Finally, this is where we get to the cartoon stuff.
They're hip.
Right on!
They're the newest and coolest heroes.
Rock, dudes!
And they're green.
Who the heck are you guys?
They're the
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Bingo. Yeah, we're dealing with a real mind here.
and they know how to battle the bad guys. So get ready
Let's show them the turtles know how to party!
for those heroes in a half shell. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles today at 4:30 on Philly 57.
This is gonna be fun!
Until the 1980s, you'd basically find just the old standbys on these stations. Classic theatrical cartoons like Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry, and Popeye. You'd also see TV cartoons that ran for years, long enough to garner a back catalog that could air every day after school. Occasionally, you would get something like Battle of the Planets, an original production of Syndication that was a dub of the anime Gatchaman. But by 1983, things were changing. New methods of distribution, such as satellite, would make it easier to distribute original shows directly to syndication. French-American studio Deke was an early adopter, premiering its Inspector Gadget that year. But Inspector Gadget wasn't the breakthrough. At the same time that syndication was ramping up, Ronald Reagan's FCC had repealed rules that restricted the content allowed in animated series targeted to children. Most notably, you could now create a cartoon based on a toy. The result?
And the Masters of the Universe.
He-Man was a smash hit, and it did not take long for its effects to be felt. Here is the October 1984 schedule for the top two independent stations in New York City, Channel 5 and Channel 11. As you can see, He-Man is the sole toy-based show in both stations' weekday lineups. Now, here's the schedule from just 1 year later. We've gone from one toy-based show to 8. A lot of these shows operated under the mentality, promote the toy first, do everything else second. Worse, many of these shows had huge 65-episode orders that premiered in one go. With the exception of Filmation, every studio would have the bulk of the animation work produced by overseas studios. Outside of maybe the title sequence, the resulting quality simply was not great. By the end of the decade, there were some signs of life. At least on Saturday mornings, there were genuine efforts to improve the quality of programming meant for kids. CBS especially. Under the leadership of Judy Price, the network was increasingly offering kid shows of notable quality, like Muppet Babies, Pee-wee's Playhouse, the Ralph Bakshi Mighty Mouse, and Garfield and Friends. ABC was not nearly as stellar, but they were the home of the surprisingly good Beetlejuice cartoon, as well as the early seasons of The Real Ghostbusters. NBC wasn't doing hot, but they had Saved by the Bell, so I guess that's something? Yet, good network executives are only going to do so much when the leading producers included a Marvel Comics-owned studio that was not making Marvel Comics cartoons, or a studio affectionately nicknamed Does It Cheap. Fortunately, in the mid-1980s, a 900-pound mouse entered the room. The 1984 arrival of a new regime at the Walt Disney Company, headed by Michael Eisner, Frank Wells, and Jeffrey Katzenberg, changed things dramatically. You're probably familiar with the Disney Renaissance, but the new management embarked on a number of other initiatives to revive the company. These included the expansion of its relatively new mature label, Touchstone Pictures, new projects for the theme park side, including what is now called Disney's Hollywood Studios, and an expanded commitment to television, including a dedicated TV animation studio. For decades, the Walt Disney Company was at best an intermittent producer of television animation. The occasional sequence for Wonderful World of Disney here, a special there. A full animated series was something of a leap for Disney, which was associated with extremely high quality animation that far outstripped what most studios were doing on television at the time. While the TV animation would not be feature quality, nor would it be produced in the United States, Disney still had money, and they would use a considerably higher budget than most studios at the time. Disney put its first TV cartoons on the air in 1985. These were new productions with new characters. What? No Mickey Mouse? Well, no. Mickey Mouse was off limits. So were Donald and Goofy. The new studio was specifically ordered to stay away from the classic Disney library of characters and start with new creations. The first two productions were Adventures of the Gummy Bears, originally for NBC, and Wuzzles, produced for CBS. Gummy Bears came from Michael Eisner himself, who was inspired when his son asked for the candy one day. Wuzzles, on the other hand, was partially funded by Hasbro. Even if the quality of animation is improving, there are still business considerations to remember. Wuzzles came and went pretty quickly, lasting just one season, but Gummy Bears proved popular and managed an extremely healthy 6-season run. The studio then moved to Bigger Fish, or more accurately, Bigger Ducks. This one would be based on one of the studio's more enduring ventures, the beloved Duck comics of Carl Barks. Donald Duck was still mostly off limits, but his nephews and Uncle Scrooge were not. And together with Barks' Rogues Gallery and new characters created specifically for television, they would all be the stars of Disney's DuckTales. This new series would be developed not for network television, but for syndication. Say what you will about He-Man, but its success opened up syndication as a viable alternative to network television, with more and more studios bypassing the networks entirely. The product at the beginning was mostly junk, so there was room for a higher quality production. Disney themselves made light of this in their trade advertising, and Disney would use syndication to enormous success over the next decade. Now, at the same time Disney was developing DuckTales, a billionaire tyrant from Australia was intent on shaking up the network business.